think it is unfortunately likely that there will be some form of military conflict between powers in the future. Um, Now, the prompt didn't specify near future or far into the future or to what scope of military conflict. So, with that in mind, as a sort of open ended prompt, I would find it likely that there will be some form of conflict. Um, I find it interesting historically, coming out of World War II and the Cold War, and really with the fall of the USSR in the 90s. I think the West has sort of almost really bought into the idea of border sanctity, and that how the lines are drawn now is how they are. Um, Anybody who knows history knows obviously the lines have changed many times throughout history, and as they are now may not be how they are in the future. And if the Western idea of border sanctity is sort of a pivotal barrier to conflict, um, as has sort of been expressed through NATO, I don't find that to be a strong defense or deterrent to conflict. Russia clearly, using the example of the current Russia-Ukraine crisis, Russia clearly doesn't have the same ideal or the same belief in border sanctity that the West has. And especially now, if we take into account the recent applications to join NATO from Sweden and Finland, which would amount to about 800 miles of added border to Russia with NATO. Again, if border sanctity is a pivotal deterrent to conflict, I find that to be a weak pivotal deterrent. Next, we are living through the rapid expanse of globalization. We as citizens are as connected or as able to connect as we have ever been, both domestically and internationally, most crucially internationally for this prompt. And right alongside with that, we're seeing decades high rates and rise in things like nationalism and tribalism, not just domestically, but again, crucially internationally, all over the globe. It's fascinating that we're seeing those two things go along together. Just separate debate, but the impact of the rise of technology and things like social media is quite fascinating. I think a lot of people would point to things like social media, but just the overall connectedness as a reason for it could be unlikely that for there to be conflict. While I acknowledge that there is potential validity in that, I would point to Russia's current actions and the rise in things like nationalism as sort of my real world counter to that idea of the potential for things like globalization to deter. So again, if border sanctity, Western ideals of globalization and democracy and capitalism and connectedness and innovation technology, if those two things are not proficient deterrents as they are not now, again, I find conflict will be likely past the current Russian-Ukraine crisis. The developing or potentially developing situations in the South Pacific with China and with North Korea, and our commitments to various nations, but I think most interestingly, our strong commitments to Japan and South Korea present a much more complex situation. Potentially not more complex, but at least equally complex diplomatic situation, certainly. The idea of proxy wars and proxy players with nations like North Korea, I think are very, very fascinating. So again, if the West is relying on border sanctity, is relying on globalization, we are currently seeing the power of bad actors and their ability to galvanize their forces behind autocracy, behind dictatorship, behind closed societies with limited access to information. And we're also seeing sort of the seeming difficulties to some extent of the democratic West to organize its resources into clear, decisive plans. So as the chips sit, I think in a dark way, it seems easier for the sort of bad guys, so to say, to galvanize and accomplish what they need, or at least start what they need. And it is seeming harder for the good guys to try to do things the right way, to sort of use grand terms, and accomplish their goals. So I do find it likely that there will be conflict.